My name's Joseph Bohigian. I'm a composer and performer from Fresno, California, currently living in Berkeley, California. And I'm currently working for Other Minds, which is an experimental music festival in the Bay Area, and also a record label, audio archive, lots of different stuff.
Like what?
Well, we do concerts throughout the year, but our main thing is our music festival, which we bring in composers from all over the world, and everyone does a set. So you get very different kinds of music on each concert. And then we do some broadcastings, like we have a radio program called Music from Other Minds, which I host once a month on KALW in San Francisco. We have a podcast called the Other Minds Podcast, which I also host, just interviews.
Where were you studying with Ken?
At Fresno State.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with Ken and Ben.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were my first composition teachers. I hadn't really done any composing before I started college. I'd done a little bit in high school. Write a piece when I was in 11th grade where it was for my AP music theory class, and it was all inside the piano. So that was sort of my opening to I can do some different things than what I used to playing in school. Yeah, sort of really started composing when I was at Fresno State.
How would you describe your music?
My early music was very percussion influenced because that was my main instrument. I was a percussionist, very rhythmic patterns, things like that. And it's very different from what I'm writing now. Like my music now, you wouldn't really be able to tell that I'm a percussionist, and I don't really play percussion much anymore, but there's very rarely rhythms that you can sort of lock onto, sometimes just no meter at all. So now I've been very interested in working with existing materials, whether that's texts or old kinds of musical notation, or just doing research into things and sampling things, bringing that into my own compositions.
Sure. So, what do you mean by that exactly? Like, let's say you're starting a new piece. Like, what would you do for it?
Usually now there's some sort of concept to connecting to something extra musical that I'm starting with. I'll talk about some of the pieces that were on my CD that just came out. So I work with recorded interviews that I'm bringing into a musical context. I'm editing them and then writing music to go along with them. Or I mentioned working with old musical notations. I have a piece where I took this old pneumatic form of Armenian musical notation that's not used anymore and created a new context for it using it in a graphic score. So sort of following the shapes gesturally. I have pieces where I'm sampling existing material, and usually I do a lot for live electronics, so doing some sort of electronic transformation to the sounds in ways that a lot of times you can't tell what they are, but sometimes if you know what they are, you can pick up on what the original sound sources are. So things like that.
Right. So you're sampling and it's referential as well.
Yeah. I had done almost no electronics until I was in grad school, and I joined one of my friends started a laptop ensemble. Her name was Nilüfer Nurbach. She went to some summer festival and did a laptop ensemble there and came back. I was like, oh, we should start one. So we started that in 2017 and turned it into a professional group. We're called Ensemble Decipher now. But I didn't really have an interest or inclination to do anything with electronics until I started performing with electronics. And that's how I really learned how to do anything with electronics. Yeah.
Sure.
I have a piece where I'm amplifying rocks and putting motion sensors on them. And so we're interacting with the rocks, and that's creating the sound.
And why don't you describe that piece a little bit? So what is it, and how's it work? What's it about, and how does it work?
Yeah, so I'll talk about both of the versions. So it's called Stone Dreams, and I wrote the ensemble version first, which was for amplified rocks and rocks with accelerometers on them. So it's measuring X, Y, and Z axes. And the title comes from a book by the Azerbaijani author Akram Aylisli. And he wrote this book about pogroms against Armenians in his country and about the town he is from in Nakhichevan, which used to have a large Armenian population, but now there's no Armenians there. And he's writing about the stone churches that have been abandoned now. And so I was thinking about the sort of the memories that are held within those stones, the things that they've seen, and like how can I symbolically bring out those memories through the stones. So in the ensemble piece, there are some people who are tapping the stones with smaller stones, and there's a contact microphone on it. So that signal is being picked up by the computer. So it's being amplified. And also, if you hit it hard enough, you get samples of some songs, them being the song Karun Karun, which is in Armenian, and the song Sana Gurban, I think it's called in Azerbaijani. And so these two songs have the same melody, it's the same tune, but they have lyrics in two different languages. And there's a whole, history of fighting between Armenians and Azerbaijanis going back to the 90s and 80s and really even earlier back to the 20s. And there have been a series of wars over the past 30 years. So I wrote this piece before the 2020 war, but was looking for connections between these two cultures who live next to each other but are very separated. you have those samples coming out from tapping the stones, and then the other players have accelerometers, so they're moving a smaller stone in different directions, so this way, and turning them around. And that's also controlling processing of these samples. And actually, it was interesting. I have an installation version of that as well. So there's a part at the end of that piece where I just took the sounds of scraping stones and put them through filters. And people in the ensemble were telling me, oh, you need to turn that into like something bigger, like maybe installation or something, because we really like these sounds. It only lasted about a minute or two in the actual piece. So I ended up doing that. I have the installation is 5 channels. So each speaker has a different filtered sound of scraping stones that are on loops of different lengths. So they're lining up differently every time they come back. And then there's just a stone in the center of the room that has a contact microphone, and people can come up and interact with it. And for those samples, I'm using recordings of folk songs that were recorded by Mihran Tumajian, who was one of the students of Komitas, who's a composer that some people may know of, and also ethnomusicologist in the early 20th century. And so he recorded these songs, or he recorded them with genocide survivors in the United States after the genocide in the early 20th century. And so the Komitas Museum put out a CD of recordings of these songs by contemporary singers. And so I'm using samples of a few of those songs for the installation. And yes, as I mentioned, like people can come up and interact with it. And again, it's the idea of sort of trying to pull the sounds out of the stones, pull the memories out of the stones. Interesting to see that someone will come up and not know what to do. So then part of the process of experiencing the installation is learning how to get sound out of the rock. So you have to usually hit it pretty hard with another rock to get it to make sound. But some people will just come up and gently caress it and nothing happens. And then maybe they'll try hitting it a little harder. Maybe they'll find the rock and they'll start hitting it and they'll understand, oh, that's how I get the sounds out. Sometimes people just come up and gently touch it and then they walk away. So I don't want to, with something like that, I don't want to tell someone how to experience it. I just want to let them figure it out for themselves.
Is that something that you planned into the piece, or is that was something you discovered after you wrote it or created an installation?
It was the first time I did it. That was when I figured out that I wanted to be pretty hands off. And the first time I did it, I actually did it in a museum at the Komitas Museum Institute in Yerevan. And there were a lot of groups of children coming through during the day. And so I was sitting there watching, and a group of kids would come up and they just would go crazy on the rock. And I'd just be hoping that they don't hit the contact microphone that's connected to it. But then the person leading them around would be like, be gentle, don't break it. But I mean, they're not going to break the rock, but it's very funny to see kids will get really into it, whereas adults will be a little bit more hesitant. Yeah, I mean, it was the first time I had done anything like that was interactive with people who aren't, playing performers that are rehearsing the piece. And I really liked it. And I've done it in a few different places now. I always have to find a new rock every time I do it because I can't fly with a rock, unfortunately. I have the original rock that I used in Armenia. I have someone hide in a courtyard just in case I need it in the future. But I found it was a really interesting way to get people who have no experience with interactive electronics to experience something like that, because they get to be part of it.
یه دیگه کو کارو چه؟
So with something like this, they get to try things out themselves. And also, if I'm there, they get to ask me questions while they're doing it. I did it once where it was in a completely dark room with just one light, and I was sitting in a corner. So some people came in and didn't know I was there, and I was sort of like watching to see what people would do. But yeah, if I'm there, sometimes people will like come up and ask me things about it, which is cool because then they can go back and try it again after what they've learned from talking to me.
Right.